I'm here with Janet from Demoler. We just got done doing a breakdown of the major news coming out of Mexico, cartel-related news. This is a segment that we've decided to keep going. It's a Q&A segment, basically fielding some of the questions that our Patreon members send over to us. So if you want to toss in some of your questions, that's how you do it. Janet, you wanna do the first one?
Sure.
Sure.
So the first one is, what is the biggest threat emerging in Mexico?
Well, what's the biggest threat emerging in Mexico? The way the question is phrased, I envision or imagine that it's from the U.S. perspective. So what's the biggest threat to the United States emerging in Mexico? I think a big part of what's going to destabilize, because Mexico's already destabilized. I think Mexico's going through a political crisis. There's a single political party that is grown in influence and power in Mexico to an absurd amount, which is the Morena party, which is currently ruling federally. I think there was a mistake made by Felipe Calderon back in his administration by taking the military out of their barracks and utilizing them as the main bludgeoning weapon against cartels. And what we're seeing in Mexico right now is the starts of a military dictatorship. Airspace in Mexico is now federalized. The military is taking contracts as road building, train track building, train building, airport building. They have a monopoly on a lot of the ways that police institutions can get formalized or armed. I think we're very much in the initial parts of a military dictatorship. And if people need further evidence of this, the U.S. arrested General Cienfuegos, Mexican army, who had recorded proven ties to one of the major criminal organizations active in Mexico. The U.S. decided to send him down to Mexico to get tried, and he was driven to his home by the Mexican government, and all of the promises of furthering the investigations against him were dropped. Mm-hmm. This should be a clear sign of who is in charge in Mexico, and if they are in charge in Mexico and we're seeing this amount of violence across the country, they're definitely not an ally to the United States interest. And I think that's the biggest threat emerging right now from Mexico.
Mm-hmm. And I think to add to your point, over a year ago, we saw that the president was also trying to change the laws around the Guardia Nacional and to basically institute it or implement it into the military body, basically becoming a military body in itself when the creation of that guard was supposed to be a civilian protection entity. So I think that was also a very worrying political development. Right now, it's still held up in courts, but there is sign that the president is trying to militarize a lot of the security institutions, a lot of the police institutions that are there for civilian control, civilian protection. So I would definitely agree with that.
And I mean, he's been systematically gutting the federal courts. Mm-hmm. As Mexico makes its way to elections in the next year. So I think there's probably going to be a political crisis of some sort coming in the next few years. And if people want to look for like a threat coming out of Mexico, people would be surprised that instead of cartels, because they've been there for a while. I think the emergence of a military dictatorship in Mexico is very much clear in the cards right now. And that's what we're in for. Okay. And what that might mean for U.S.-Mexico relationships, I don't know.
And we're not new to that. You know, we did have that before. So, and I think to add to another emerging threat, I think what I see in Mexico here is what's particularly concerning is also the fragmentation of existing cartel groups into different bands that are either conflicting amongst themselves or conflicting amongst other criminal entities. I mean, what some of the biggest hotspots that we see in the country in Guanajuato, in Zacatecas, Chiapas, we're seeing this fragmentation of bigger groups into smaller groups, fighting lower criminal bands, and then just the expansion of insecurity, the expansion of, different warring zones.
And I think another aspect of this is pretty interesting to kind of observe is that some of these smaller groups, they're not specifically fighting for a transnational cartel operation. They're fighting over giant local drug markets in Mexico. We're seeing some of that in Tulum, where Americans are now living down there. We're seeing some of this in Tijuana, where Americans are now living here. The drug markets come with them and grow. So a lot of these small groups are seemingly more powerful because they're just fighting for that local drug market. So this is making the conflict even more complex.
Exactly. And it's also interesting what's becoming that landscape is that, previously enemy rival groups are now joining together to fight, for example, the Jalisco cartel. We see with Guerreros Unidos, who are just a faction of different criminal organizations operating that same territory that have just come together to fight a larger enemy.
Sometimes in collaboration with the federal government that joins them as well.
Yeah, we see that in Michoacan.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
It's complex. I think one thing that the U.S. just has to keep in mind, the Mexican government is not necessarily about U.S. interest. And it's not going to be probably your ally for long if things keep going kind of down this route. Cartels are politicized. We just had the president of Mexico just went for the 5th or 6th time in his presidency, went to Bandiraguata to inaugurate a road. Historically, the birthplace of the Sinaloa cartel, some of the Sinaloa cartel's most prolific members. So the line between government and cartel is completely blurred. So when I say that the emergent threat in Mexico is the government itself, I think it's because cartels have already politicized and it's hard to delineate at high levels who the threat is going to be coming from. So
exactly. And we see that quite clearly ahead of election season, and we're coming up to a new election cycle. And, we see it very clearly that there is a lot of influence or at least direct collusion with, political candidates and groups in their municipalities, criminal groups in their municipalities.
do you see the type of conflicts and open warfare that is happening in southern Mexico making its way through northern border towns like Mexicali, San Luis Rio Colorado, etc.? And if so, what kind of timeline would you guess? That's an interesting question. So we during the last news breakdown, we just talked about an issue that's happening in Chiapas right now. Basically, local cartels getting involved in internal politics and assassinating one of their own, and then that getting used as an excuse for the new generation cartel to kind of like move in and take advantage of some of these situations. They're on the border, the southern border. They have a ocean next to them, so a lot of things can go in and out. It's a strategic spot. I think we're going to start seeing a flare-up of this kind, and we're already starting to see a lot of violence in the eastern part of Tijuana. You're seeing a lot of reports of migrants being murdered, of polleros being targeted, and basically skirmishes along that eastern part of the border in Tijuana for control. It's not a very easy to patrol part of the border, but historically, the new generation cartel has not controlled any part of the northern border with the United States, historically. I think we're seeing a change in that. And when that happens, we're going to see things like it's going on right now in Chiapas, two major cartels in open warfare on a border, and the military of the neighboring country basically reinforcing its border and shooting back. There's something in the forecast for Mexico. When the new generation cartel gains control of a large segment of the border wall, which I don't think it has yet, I think that's when you're going to see this violence that's going to spill over. Mexicali is a pretty good candidate for it. Parts of Sonora is a pretty good candidate for it, but I think it's probably going to be flaring up somewhere in the Tecate to the eastern Tijuana border region. I think that's when the event is going to occur. Once this happens, it's going to be a fight on the border for the border, and there's no way you can do that on the northern border without attracting the attention of the U.S. And I think that's when we're going to see a change in policy. I think that's where we're headed.
We've seen how prevalent the use of drones have become in the Ukrainian conflict. I wonder how long until these drones make their way up across the fence. Are cartels down south starting to utilize these methods more frequently? Example, dropping explosives with 3D printed modifications, etc.
I've been collaborating by just sharing information with EOD teams in the United States for about 4 or 5 years. And drone technology has been used in Mexico for years, before the Ukrainian conflict, even before the ISIS situation in Syria. I, myself, and a few other of my friends who were active found the first cartel drone probably 10 minutes walk that way. We're right on the border fence right now. So these have been in use for years. There was a clandestine explosive testing ground found somewhere in, Jalisco. I think it was Jalisco where it was found. And they found a lot of 3D printed devices that are very reminiscent of the stuff that are utilizing in Ukraine, specifically things that are made to release or to actuate. Mexico doesn't have a lot of just spare ordnance laying around, or mortars or grenades. So it's mining level explosives being utilized with detonators, very reminiscent of some of the IRA manuals of old times. But it's basically, Mexico has become a pretty interesting laboratory for fourth generational warfare aspects that are being now showcased across the world. It happened here first, not in the Ukraine, and not by ISIS. The first time I saw a grenade attached to a drone was in Baja. So.
Yeah, and we see this across a lot of military operations around any, training grounds or cartel training grounds. We see drones consistently there. They're used across Michoacán, between the Jalisco cartel and the Guerreros Unidos, or Carteles Unidos. We see it in Chiapas as well. Jalisco cartel has been using it. We see a lot of drone footage as well from these videos where they're just dropping explosives. They started putting, or they have been putting, shuttlecocks around the explosives to basically stabilize it. So yeah, this is consistently something that we see.
Explosives combined with pesticide chemicals, which is something pretty unique to here. I don't see that having been done anywhere else, but it's something that's commonly done in parts of Mexico. For surveillance and for spotting. We've seen the Ukrainians utilize drones for spotting scopes or to direct their artillery strikes. Cartels are basically doing the same thing. Hey, there's a bunch of dudes hiding behind that building over there, and they send a drone out to kind of spy on them. So these are being utilized for a lot of disruptive means and methods. There was a giant theft of a field, drone theft, right? So, so they're very much in use in Mexico and have been in use in Mexico, I think, since the start of them coming on the scene as far as technology.
Yeah, and they still haven't found those missing drones from that cargo trailer. So.
Yeah, so they're going to find them in pieces at some point. I think that this is an interesting one. The most interesting use of a drone that I was told about by a member of the federal police is that they utilized some sort of pairing technology, basically one piece of technology that finds the other, so it hones to itself, related to drones. They put that in a vehicle that they then blew up by landing a drone that basically went out and seeked out that specific car, landed on it, and made it blow up, killing the occupants. That's a lot of sophistication. And the part of it that freaked them out, and when I say them out, my friends who were part of this federal investigation police, is the ease and the cheapness of the technology. How you can basically mark somebody for death and just set up a drone, and what they put into it as far as money and investment was very cheap, cheaper than a gun. So that's the worrying part of it, I guess. Any comments on how cartels are trying to eradicate fentanyl production via threats? Is this propaganda, PR? I think he's probably referring to some of the Sinaloa cartel efforts to go after or to ban the sale and manufacturing of fentanyl in Sinaloa. What do you think?
So I think, it was interesting when we started. So we started seeing narcomantas, which are like the banners put up by the Sinaloa cartel saying that anyone caught producing fentanyl was going to be basically targeted by the Sinaloa cartel. And this was headed by Los Chapitos, basically a faction of the sons of El Chapo. What was particularly interesting is that this is when, the U.S. was trying to extradite Ovidio Guzman, the son of El Chapo. So we also saw a letter that Los Chapitos wrote saying that they weren't involved in any fentanyl production. They weren't instigating it. They basically just washed their hands clean. So, is it a PR stunt, particularly to absolve themselves of fentanyl production? Probably. Because we do see that they are trafficking fentanyl. Yeah. The Sinaloa is consistently one of the highest ones trafficking fentanyl. So it came at a very politically convenient time, and then Ovidio was extradited to the U.S. And I haven't seen many narcomantas yet.
I think the very telling thing about this is that they stopped putting those banners up as soon as it's something that's basically forgotten news. So it was very much an attempt to send a message and very much a PR campaign. Los Chapitos, for some reason, are being heavily targeted by the United States right now, and they're very much also being targeted by Mexican authorities. There seems to be some sort of rift happening internally in that organization. There's no way you can function as a cartel that is dealing with the sale and trafficking of substances without touching fentanyl and being in any way, shape, or form competitive now. So that's very telling. Pill presses, fentanyl, and fentanyl-infused products like heroin. This is the way you base your business off of. If you don't have that, you're really not doing anything. So I think it's very much a PR thing. Cool. Well, those were great questions. Keep them coming. We're gonna try and pull what we can and answer what we can. A big part of the intention behind these is to give you an information dump, something direct from the source. Jeanette and Demoler operates out of Mexico. They're not in the U.S. I operate on the U.S. side and on the Mexican side. And I work and travel and talk to a lot of people, and I still have a lot of the connections that I used to have when I was active. So a lot of this information is coming from that source. It's hard to track and piece out who is trying to put forward a narrative, because there is such a thing as cartel propaganda, and they do have mouthpieces that they use to push their propaganda out. The government does the same thing. The U.S. government does the same thing, and media as a whole does the same thing. On our end, we have a vested interest in this country being safer because we have family here. A big part of our intention and part of the intention of this project is to bring awareness to this. I think the U.S. and Mexico are tied by blood, by economy, by the earth. We are very much attached at the hip, and one thing that happens to one of us affects the other. There is a very, very, very important event that's going to happen in Mexico within the next year, which is the presidential elections. I know the U.S. is going towards their own, It's interesting how both of these are going to be basically tied in a lot of ways. There is no clear political rival for the current ruling party in Mexico. So they're very much
Up for grabs.
it's very much up for grabs. We are in the start of what I perceive to be a military dictatorship of a kind, at least from the shadows. And China's all over Mexico, and Russia's all over Mexico, and there's a lot of things happening in Mexico that are very much related to using Mexico as a subversive force against the United States, is what I perceive. So I think it's in the interest of everybody to kind of pay attention to what's happening down south, and to realize that a lot of the things that are happening down south are happening up north as well in small ways. And if people don't want them to happen in bigger ways, they should probably pay attention. History doesn't repeat itself, but it oftentimes does rhyme. And I'm seeing a lot of it rhyming in the U.S. in the future, in the near future, if we don't do anything about it.